Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you having the hearing. And I'm glad that the Biden administration officials are here to testify at this public hearing before the subcommittee. It's definitely been quite a while since we've had this kind of testimony. I appreciate all of you joining us. I would like to note that we also invited Dr. Anthony Fauci, the chief medical advisor to President Biden and the director of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. But regrettably, he sent this letter that he was unable to attend because he would need to be invited by the chairman with permission from the Biden administration. So, Mr. Chairman, hopefully you will invite Dr. Fauci. I think we all want to hear from him. Just as a note, it's been 309 days since we've heard Dr. Fauci testify before any committee in the House. So I don't know if Speaker Pelosi is trying to silence Dr. Fauci. We asked that he come. He was not allowed to come. And I think he should be part of this hearing. I sure hope we rectify that soon. It is important to hear from the witnesses today about the current state of COVID and planning for the future. But I think it's imperative that we address the elephant in the room. The public has lost a lot of trust in public health officials over the last 2 years, and we've seen flip-flopping, we've seen mistakes, we've seen power grabbing, and we've seen political interference with the science during this last year and a half especially. I hope the witnesses will address the following issues directly today. There is a long list of controversies that the American public is looking for answers from, and I'd like to name just a few of them, and I hope that we can have the witnesses address them in either their remarks or during questioning. First, it was uncovered that there was direct political interference with CDC's school reopening guidance from the 2021 report. President Biden's CDC discarded historical practices to allow a radical teachers union that just so happens to be a major supporter of Democrats to bypass agency norms and directly change official CDC guidance. The damaging edits by union bosses effectively kept thousands of schools shuttered across the country, which locked millions of children out of their classrooms. The Biden administration abandoned medical science and replaced it with political science. And by the way, gave unprecedented VIP access to one of their largest supporters, harming millions of children in the process. Mr. Chairman, a lot of this was documented through some of the testimony we received, and House Republicans put together a summary of this in a report that we released. I would like to ask unanimous consent to include this report in the record, and I know, Mr. Chairman, we provided you with a copy.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Roughly $200 billion in taxpayer money was spent with the intention of safely reopening schools. Yet many remained closed even after they took the taxpayer money. Students have suffered severe learning loss and emotional and social problems. I hope that Dr. Walensky will address this scandal that we've outlined and provide answers for us today on those allegations made, especially as it relates to the unprecedented action that the union bosses were able to get to make major edits to a CDC document weeks before it was released to the public. The list goes on. The CDC recommended little kids wear masks all day, both indoors and outdoors, for almost 2 years. They did this without any reliable scientific evidence of masking effectiveness in toddlers, an action that likely caused developmental delays for millions of children. And even in hearings before this committee, we've had testimony that identified and talked about the concerns to children from this last few years. In 2021, the CDC recommended that kids at summer camp wear masks even while outdoors, even though we all knew that outdoor COVID transmission was highly unlikely. Again, amongst children, we saw those numbers. Recently, after a long, torturous 2 years of masking guidance, the CDC has finally changed its metrics for masking, effectively allowing most of the country to take masks off. This change just so happened to coincide with a memo from President Biden's pollster that showed people are fed up with COVID restrictions like masks. So again, not following the science, following the political science after the pollster to the president came out with this data that the public is fed up with this approach. Of course, I welcome the change in masking, but why weren't these metrics used all along? I hope the witnesses will explain that today. It's also been reported by the New York Times that the CDC has failed to publish essential information about COVID-19 hospitalizations, at least in part, as they report, to control the narrative around vaccine effectiveness. Reports indicate that the CDC has in fact collected data on vaccine and booster shot effectiveness, as well as breakthrough infections and wastewater analysis, but has delayed its release and released only small portions of the data, and in some cases, none at all. States and localities could have used the withheld data to better inform their efforts to mitigate the virus's spread in their area. CDC spokesman Kristen Nordland stated that the agency has been slow to release the data they routinely collected because, quote, basically at the end of the day, it's not yet ready for prime time, close quote, and they feared the information might be misrepresented. Again, let the science be put out there transparently and let everybody explain it. If it's hard to explain, maybe other decisions should have been made, but people should have been given access to that data. This is why the majority of Americans do not trust the CDC and what they've said about COVID. What happened, by the way, to the transparency that we were promised by President Biden? On top of that, it was recently revealed that the CDC was publishing inaccurate data. An adjustment was made to the CDC COVID data tracker's mortality data on March 15th, and it involved the removal of 72,277 deaths, including 416 pediatric deaths, reducing the number of pediatric deaths from COVID-19 by nearly 24%. This is not some minor error if that's what it really was. A CDC spokesman told the Washington Examiner that CDC's algorithm was accidentally counting deaths that were not COVID-19 related. The flawed data indicated that children were dying at an increased rate during the Omicron surge, yet in fact, it turns out they were not. What decisions were made off of this inaccurate data? And by the way, I'd also like to hear who has been held accountable for this mistake, if it was a mistake, if not worse. I hope we get that addressed today because it was a very costly mistake. Then there's the controversy over the Biden administration's inaction with procuring tests and rejection of a plan to provide millions of rapid tests in time for the Christmas holiday when the Omicron surge was at its highest. Sadly, we've had to endure the Biden administration's alienation of the unvaccinated instead of focusing on a science-driven approach that includes vaccination and natural immunity, undermining trust, once again, in the vaccine and dividing Americans. It's not a time that should have happened. President Biden's unlawful vaccine mandate on employees of private businesses was stopped by the Supreme Court. This overt power grab backfired and further increased vaccine hesitancy. The Biden administration has also been sidelining the science on boosters. First, in the summer of 2021, the Biden administration announced the availability of booster shots for all adults by September 2021. But amazingly, they made this announcement before the FDA and the CDC finished even reviewing the data to determine the need for booster shots. Because of this, two senior FDA officials actually left the agency amid alarming reports of reported political interference with the scientists by the Biden administration. This was obviously very confusing for the public, fueling their continued distrust in public health guidance. Republicans on the select subcommittee are still the only ones in Congress to hold a hearing on the origins of COVID-19. For whatever reason, Democrats in Washington still refuse to have a hearing on the origin. The US apparently was funding risky gain-of-function research in China. Taxpayers should know about that as well, and we should have a debate and discussion about whether this should even be funding. We should even be funding this kind of controversial research. in the United States or in another country. Unredacted emails show doctors Fauci and Collins were warned that COVID-19 came from that lab in February of 2020, yet they worked to stifle any hypothesis that the virus could have been started in a lab. Again, how much time was lost? How many lives were lost? Telling people that something is a conspiracy when it turned out to be true. I hope the witnesses will address all of these issues today. I know the American public is looking for answers and wants the transparency they were promised that they still haven't gotten from the Biden administration. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and look forward to the testimony from our witnesses.